My next topic is a discussion of adaptation in reform of Islamic law. There is a chapter 12 in this book, my book, Sharia Law, an Introduction. And my discussion is basically a rehash of what I have written. I will be looking at four aspects of the reform of Islamic law. Basically, the 20th century, but I will be looking back to put the whole of this discussion into perspective. Then I look at the writing methodology and styles like the encyclopedias, for example, of 20th century, codification movement, and then research, emergence of universities. To discuss the adaptation and reform of Islamic law, we need to look back into historical background so that we can then identify our subject matter a little clearly. We'll be looking at 6 phases in the development of fiqh. This is really historical discussion. The first 5 phases I will be very briefly just drawing a profile, and then the last phase will be the 20th century reform of Islamic law. The first 5 phases of the formative stages of Islamic law, of course, begin with the prophetic period when the Prophet started his mission. The Quran was revealed and the Prophet explained the Quran through his own exemplary conduct in Sunnah. That period lasted from 610 Common Era to 632. At that time, the subject was not Islamic law that was so much in focus. It was a dogma in belief in the moral values of Islam, not so much the fiqh as we are concerned with today. And during that time also the practical rules of Sharia actually unfolded in the second period after the Prophet's migration to Medina. Ijtihad was not really exercised at that time by others, as the Prophet himself was able to deliver the rulings of issues directly. The second phase is that of the companions that lasted again for 31 years, 632 to 661. They were also focused on the study of the Quran and Sunnah, collection of hadith, and expanding the scope of the ahkam. There were the beginnings of the fiqh as a subject and discipline. The companions have made a lasting impact on the development of Islamic law, partly because they took a comprehensive approach, a rational approach to the understanding of the Sharia, and they looked into the effect, the rationale, the objectives, as well as the reading of the text, and consultative approach that they took towards the application of the textual rulings of Sharia to particular issues. The Khulafa Rashidun, the first rightly guided caliphs, they are known for their distinctive contribution to the development of Islamic law. Then the third phase is the era of the successors, or the Tabi'un, that lasted from 661 to 750, about 90 years. And during this time, the territorial domain of Islam expanded. In Islam and the Sharia came into contact with other older traditions, and this is the time when issues of greater complexity were addressed. Then the scholastic development, proponents of tradition and proponents of personal opinion, Ahl al-Hadith, Ahl al-Ra'ya, they emerged in Mecca in Medina, the Ahl al-Hadith in the Iraqi cities of Kufa and Basra, which was the center of scholastic studies orientated more toward the exercise of personal opinion. It was during this time also that Shia Mazhab emerged. The jurisprudence of Shia jurisprudence started to be formulated this time. The fourth phase of the development of fiqh is known as the era of ijtihad, and this is known to have lasted 2 centuries, 750 to 950, and the 4 leading mazhabs, the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi and Hanbali, emerged during this time. They made contributions to the sources of the Sharia as well as the fiqh. The Hanafis, and they are known to have contributed the qiyas, istihsan and urf, and others have in their turn made contributions to the development of both the sources of the law and the subject matter of fiqh. And it was Imam al-Shafi who attempted to reconcile these 2 approaches of the Ahl al-Hadith and Ahl al-Ra'ya into a combined approach, and he is known to have acquired this name Nasir al-Ummah, the Sunnah, Nasir al-Sunnah, the champion of the Sunnah. He articulated the legal theory of Usul al-Fiqh. He lived most of his lifetime in Baghdad, but in the last 5 years he traveled and domiciled in Egypt, and he established a new mazhab because he encountered the customs of Egyptian society so different to that of the Iraqi society that he changed many of his original fatwas. And the Hanbali mazhab, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he died 855 Common Era. He contributed the Hanbali school to the theory of contract and also to istishab, and the Zahiri school also. Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri died the same year, 855, as Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And the Hanbali school was declining, almost becoming extinct, until the 18th century, the emergence of the Wahhabi movement and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab that gave it a fresh impetus and revived the Hanbali school, mainly through the readings of the works of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, his disciple. And these mazahib now apply to this day, all in different geographical zones. In the 5th era is the era of imitative scholarship, the era of taqlid or imitation, which consists mainly of the institutionalization of the existing doctrines, and the scholars began themselves and occupied themselves with writing commentaries and glosses, and not so much exercise of original thinking and ijtihad. And this is the longest period in the history of Islamic law, lasting right until the 20th century, saw the collapse of the Abbasid and Ottoman Empire, the emergence of the West as military power, and then colonialism and an expansion of Western legal and judicial doctrines into the Muslim lands, and so much so that the fiqh in Sharia generally was sidelined. And so was the link between the fiqh and the realities of social life, and that is why that ijtihad in original thinking suffered a new blow through the domination of Western law and doctrine in Muslim countries. And lastly, the second phase in the adaptation and reform of Islamic law begins with the onset, the dawn of 20th century in the hands of Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, and his disciple Muhammad Rashid Rida. And the renewed call for the revival of ijtihad through recourse directly to the original sources of Islam, and then followed the two world wars and the collapse of colonialism, and then the rise of nationalism and independence movement in the Muslim lands. And then we have this Islamic resurgence and revivalism, the demand for the revival of the Sharia into the fabric of law and governance in Muslim lands that were dominated by colonial powers. There was this demand, and for decades we have seen a mass movement and a mass demand for the revival of their own heritage in the Sharia. But there was a contrary opinion, mainly by these Western educated, that the Sharia does not offer a feasible alternative to constitutional theories and some aspects of Western law. The Sharia has fallen behind social reality. But then we see the emergence of constitutionalism and promulgation of constitutions in Muslim countries, declaring, for example, Islam as the state religion and also Sharia as the source of law and legislation in their respective countries. We saw also codification of the fiqh, and in a new form, in a new style. The fiqh books, they were written in their own ways, with poor classification, and not addressing the demands and realities of modernity. They were also a little too complex perhaps in some ways. The new demand was that we also depart from this scholastic orientation, the mazhab orientation of the fiqh. And countries that retain the common law tradition, like Pakistan, Malaysia, Sudan, they combine this practical approach with the study of fiqh and the kind of a merger of fiqh with parliamentary legislation as well as judicial precedent. Codification became as an earnest engagement, codification of Islamic law in many countries, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria. The Egyptian scholar Abdul Razak al-Sanhuri died 1971. He is contributed to the legislation processes, especially the emergence of civil codes, and he adopted a mixed approach, combining Western doctrines with those of the Sharia. And then we see also movements in different parts of the Muslim world that had characteristics of their own in the development in their approach to the reform of Islamic law. But when discussing codification, the Ottoman Mujalla that was composed and authored by the ulama of Turkey in 1876, consisting of 1850 articles compiled into 16 chapters and an introduction. It was the first organized codification of the Islamic law of transaction, excluding Islamic family law, that remained influential for many decades to come. And soon after that, Turkey promulgated the Family Rights Act 19 17, which expanded the scope, whereas the Mujalla was based mainly on Hanafi jurisprudence. Turkish family rights law of 1917, they took from the other schools also, not only relied on the Hanafi. So this was a new development to expand the scope of legislation in codification. And also another dimension of the same opening is that now reliance is being made on the opinion of individual scholars and jurists, and not always on the rulings of the established mazahib. The Syrian law of personal status 1953 started a new beginning, and that was the beginning of ijtihad through statutory legislation, whereas earlier these were the fiqh works we are seeing, but now ijtihad finds its place in the working of parliamentary assemblies. And then we see in mid-20th century in countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Iraq, Pakistan, they introduced civil codes or family personal status laws, attempting reforms of the Islamic family law in certain areas like polygamy, like divorce, offering new interpretation to the original data of the Quran. 20th century has seen a progressive movement in demand for the reform of Islamic law in the expansion of ijtihad, not to be confined to any particular school, but to draw from the wider sources of Sharia as well as the contribution of the mazahib. But not just that, but the contribution of modern scholars, not only even of Sharia scholars, but scholars in different other disciplines that are equally important for the progress of law in society. Then we also see in some of the legislation that came about consolidated approach of both the traditional and modern opinion in contributions. The Jordanian Civil Code 1976 is a good example, adopted by United Arab Emirates in Sudan, for example. And now the effort to formulate a unified civil code for the Arab world, for example. Then in Pakistan we see the emergence of a slightly different movement, and that is to bring into conformity the existing legislation, even from the colonial time, with the Sharia of Islam, with the rulings of the Quran and Sunnah. And this became the principal task of the constitutional body in Pakistan. In the early 1950s, Council of Islamic Ideology was given this task within 5 years to look into all the statutory codes and identify those which were contrary to Sharia. And after 5 years, they found that only 10% of the existing laws showed some divergence from the Sharia, and therefore reforming of some of those laws. In Pakistan it was a gradual approach, but the Sudan took a rather sudden approach and not case by case. Therefore some of their legislation, like the Penal Code of 1983, was less than successful. In the Civil Law 1984 of Sudan, was confined to some areas of the Sharia and not comprehensive enough. Then we see this movement that the basic principle of Sharia was permissibility of all that was not contrary to Islam and its doctrine. Yet we now see that Western doctrines can be taken so long as they are not contrary Sharia. But scholars like Hassan Turabi and Jamaluddin Atiyah, they have warned that liberal import of the laws of Western origin, even in the areas of commerce and industry and economics, should be with care and not that contradict the basic underlying philosophy and objectives of the Sharia. Another movement that mentions a brief mention is the formation, the compilation of the encyclopedias of fiqh, and that of 20th century origin. And the law reform movement and legislation we mentioned, they were selective, of course, of certain areas, but there was need for consolidated, easily accessible presentation of the Sharia that could be used as tools for ijtihad, and therefore the proposition by the OIC and other Muslim countries to come up with encyclopedias of fiqh. We now have the Encyclopedia Mawsu'a Fiqhiyya of Kuwait in 45 volumes, started in 1971 and already coming to conclusion. Egypt started its own Encyclopedia of Fiqh, and so did Syria, but they were discontinued, and others have also made similar attempts. The approach here is that they are no longer scholastic. They are not based on one. The Encyclopedia of Kuwait, for example, give the 8 mazhabs, including the Zawahiri, Zaidi, Ibadi, and Jafari, in addition to the 4 existing mazhab. Yet we move further. The encyclopedias were an uncritical reproductive effort, although very valuable, but now the need was felt for a better preparation for ijtihad, and therefore the emergence of the fiqh or Islamic law academies that exercise collective ijtihad. Many conferences were formed in several fiqh academies, international fiqh academies. There are 2 in Saudi Arabia, 1 in Jeddah, 1 in Mecca, and the fiqh academies of Jeddah are representatives for all Muslim countries. India and Pakistan have their own similar fiqh academies and Sharia academies. Then institutions of Islamic research emerged in Islamic universities, and issues of particular concern, test tube babies, artificial insemination, organ transplant, time of Salat in Antarctica, and so on. These are being studied and fatwas are being delivered, and the Fiqh Academy resolutions in fatwa are also attempted with the participation of expert opinion outside the Sharia. Experts are invited into different. Then Pakistan gave it a constitutional foundation through the formation of the Council of Islamic Ideology of I mentioned. Malaysia also has a Fatwa Council, the federal level that all the muftis sit in for deliberate over issues of contemporary and topical concern. And now the last area of development is Islamic banking and finance. They also have their sitting Sharia scholars and advisors. In the area of teaching and research, we have seen the emergence of Islamic universities in teaching in the university course format, focus research, master's degree and PhD research. They have taken different approaches, sometimes new disciplines of Sharia like Islamic constitutional law, Islamic economics, Islamic banking and finance. They have emerged, and the attention is given not only to scholarship of the mazahib, but individual scholars and all those who have contributed. And finally, the teaching of Islam in the West is still remains theoretical, although research has widened its scope, remains fairly overcritical of Islam and the Sharia, although there was some adjustment in balance inside until the 9/11 attacks came and the gains that were made perhaps were set back. And there was also in Malaysia and certain other countries, Islamic law courses in degree programs introduced even in non-Muslim Asian countries like Thailand and Philippines and India. They offer full courses on fiqh and Sharia. And yet another aspect that is worth mentioning is Islamization program emerged in Pakistan and Sudan. Now they want the whole of their legal structure and all the laws applied in the land to be consistent in conformity with Islam on a systemic basis. And then we have now a closer nexus between fiqh and parliamentary legislation. This is the result of the demands that we have seen for reform. Contributions were made through the fatwa collection by many ulama of Egypt, the retired Sheikh of Azhar, Shaltut, Mahraza, Tantawi, even the scholar Qaradawi, they have come up with volumes of their contributions and their fatwas, and some of the courts, the Supreme Courts and the Federal Sharia Courts of Pakistan, they have made important decisions that have reformulated some aspects of the Sharia, and it is still continuing work. We have seen adaptation and reform of Islamic law into various phases, and it seems that the demand has grown even wider. That was the discussion briefly of 20th century reforms of Islamic law.